The myth of Axis oil, how fuel shortages dictated every move, caught your eye. But have you ever stopped to wonder why certain historical narratives stick, even when the truth is far more complex, far more inconvenient? Perhaps it's the comfort of a simpler story, or maybe it's that deep, human unease with the chaos that uncertainty brings, a fear that even the most powerful plans can be undone by something as simple and seemingly mundane as a lack of fuel. We often imagine the Axis powers, particularly Nazi Germany, as an unstoppable, relentlessly efficient war machine, fueled by a bottomless well of resources and a terrifying, singular will. The Blitzkrieg, the lightning war, seems to scream of abundant power, of panzer divisions roaring across Europe, aircraft darkening the skies, and U-boats prowling the Atlantic. But beneath this veneer of invincibility lay a stark, suffocating truth. The Axis powers were chronically, desperately short of oil, and this shortage wasn't just a minor inconvenience. It was the invisible hand that reshaped battle plans, crippled ambitions, and ultimately, carved their path to defeat. This isn't just a footnote in history, it's the central, tragic drama of their war. Imagine, for a moment, being at the helm of a nation plunging into a global conflict, knowing that the very lifeblood of your military, the oil that powers tanks, planes, and ships, is not within your control. That was the chilling reality for Germany, Italy, and Japan. Their industrial bases were robust, their populations disciplined, their tactical minds often brilliant, but they lacked indigenous access to crude oil in sufficient quantities. This wasn't a secret held from their enemies, it was a glaring vulnerability, exploited relentlessly by the Allies, who held sway over the world's major oil fields. Let's begin with Germany, the spearhead of the Axis. When Hitler launched his aggressive expansionist policies, he did so with an economy already stretched thin and an industrial capacity heavily reliant on imported raw materials. Oil was at the top of that critical list. Germany's pre-war domestic oil production was minuscule, barely scratching the surface of its needs. The vast majority had to be imported, primarily from the Americas and the Middle East. With the declaration of war and the subsequent Allied naval blockades, these supply lines were instantly severed. This created an immediate, existential crisis. The Nazi regime knew this from the start. Their military planning, their very strategy for conquest, was intrinsically linked to securing new oil resources. This desperation wasn't a hidden flaw, it was a fundamental driver. Take, for instance, the synthetic fuel program. Germany was a pioneer in this field, developing processes like the Fischer-Tropsch method to convert coal, which Germany had in abundance, into liquid fuels. This was an astonishing feat of engineering, driven by dire necessity. By 1944, synthetic fuels accounted for over 90% of Germany's aviation fuel and more than 50% of its total petroleum supply. Without these synthetic plants, Germany's war effort would have ground to a halt years earlier. But even this technological marvel had its limitations. Building and operating these plants was incredibly expensive, energy-intensive, and required massive amounts of manpower and strategic resources that could have been used elsewhere. Furthermore, the output, while significant, was never enough to meet the escalating demands of a multi-front war. Every tank sortie, every Luftwaffe mission, every U-boat patrol chipped away at a finite, precious reserve. This scarcity profoundly influenced tactical and strategic decisions, pushing Germany towards aggressive, resource-grabbing campaigns. The early successes of the Blitzkrieg in Poland and France were dazzling, creating an illusion of boundless energy. Panzer divisions, supported by close air support, swept through enemy lines with unprecedented speed. Yet, even in these early triumphs, the shadow of oil scarcity loomed. Supply lines struggled to keep pace, and commanders were constantly battling logistics, not just enemy resistance. The very speed that made the Blitzkrieg so effective also devoured fuel at an alarming rate. Imagine a general, fresh off a victory, immediately having to worry not about consolidating gains, but about where the next barrel of crude was coming from. That was the German reality. As the war expanded, Germany's need for oil became a ravenous beast. The invasion of the Soviet Union, Operation Barbarossa, launched in June 1941, was perhaps the most audacious and ultimately self-destructive gamble motivated by oil. The German war machine, facing a formidable industrial and population base in the east, was designed to strike quickly, to deliver a knockout blow before the vastness of Russia could swallow them whole. But beneath the ideological justifications and the ambition for Lebensraum, lay the desperate need to seize the oil-rich fields of the Caucasus, particularly Baku, then one of the world's largest oil-producing regions. Hitler himself understood this implicitly. He declared that if he did not get the oil of Maykop and Grozny, he would have to end the war. This wasn't mere rhetoric, it was a chilling statement of strategic reality. The German advance towards Stalingrad and the Caucasus was not just a drive for territory or a pivotal psychological victory, it was a race against time and dwindling fuel reserves to reach the energy salvation that lay hundreds of miles further east. But the logistics of such a vast campaign were staggering. The sheer distances, the poor roads, and the brutal Russian winters conspired against them. Tanks and trucks consumed enormous quantities of fuel, which then had to be transported over thousands of miles of stretched supply lines, often under partisan attack. The further the Wehrmacht pushed, the more acutely they felt the pinch. Tanks ran out of gas, not just shells. Aircraft were grounded due to lack of aviation fuel. The vast, mechanized army that had shocked Europe found itself increasingly bogged down, its engines silent. The Battle of Stalingrad, often seen as a turning point due to its strategic location and immense human cost, was also a battle profoundly influenced by fuel. The entire Sixth Army, encircled and eventually annihilated, found its mobility crippled, its air support diminished, and its supplies cut off. The dream of Caucasian oil remained just that, a dream, eternally just out of reach. Across the globe, Japan, another core Axis power, faced an even more precarious situation. Unlike Germany, Japan was an island nation with virtually no domestic oil reserves. Its entire industrial and military complex was utterly dependent on imports, primarily from the United States. In the years leading up to Pearl Harbor, a staggering 80% of Japan's oil came from the U.S. This dependence was a critical vulnerability that the U.S. sought to exploit to curb Japanese aggression in China and Southeast Asia. The American embargoes of 1940 and 1941, culminating in a complete oil embargo in July 1941, were a crushing blow. They forced Japan into an impossible corner. Without oil, its powerful navy, its nascent air force, and its land armies would be paralyzed. The strategic calculus for Japan became stark: either capitulate to American demands and abandon its imperial ambitions, or seize new oil sources by force, knowing that such an action would inevitably lead to war with the United States. Japan chose the latter, gambling on a swift, decisive victory that would secure its resource base before America could fully mobilize. The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, devastating as it was ultimately a tactical victory born of strategic desperation. Its primary objective was to cripple the U.S. Pacific Fleet long enough for Japan to establish a greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere, a euphemism for an empire encompassing the rich natural resources of Southeast Asia, especially the oil fields of the Dutch East Indies, modern-day Indonesia. The oil fields of Borneo, Sumatra, and Java were the glittering prize that drove the initial, rapid Japanese expansion across the Pacific. In the early months of the Pacific War, Japan achieved spectacular successes, seizing control of these vital oil-producing regions. The images of Japanese forces sweeping through Malaya and Singapore, the Philippines, and the Dutch East Indies, project an image of unstoppable might. But even with these new acquisitions, the problem wasn't solved, it merely shifted. The challenge transformed from acquiring oil to transporting it safely back to the Japanese home islands. The vast distances of the Pacific, coupled with the growing strength of the Allied submarine campaigns, turned the sea lanes into a gauntlet. Japanese tankers, unescorted or inadequately protected, became prime targets for American submarines. Every sunk tanker represented a direct blow to Japan's war-making capacity. The oil that Japan so desperately needed was often either sitting in distant, vulnerable ports, or at the bottom of the ocean. This constant drain on resources meant that even Japan's formidable navy, the Imperial Japanese Navy, often found itself on strict fuel rationing. Imagine the psychological toll on commanders who, despite having some of the most powerful warships in the world, had to constantly worry about how much fuel they had left, restricting training exercises and high-speed maneuvers. The Battle of Midway, a pivotal turning point in the Pacific War, also subtly highlighted the fuel crunch. While often discussed in terms of intelligence, carrier tactics, and pilot skill, the long logistical tail for Japanese operations meant that their fleet had to cover vast distances, consuming precious fuel. As the war progressed, the problem intensified. By late 1944 and 1945, Japan's remaining oil supplies were so critically low that its once mighty navy was effectively confined to port. Battleships like the Yamato and Musashi, some of the largest ever built, sat idle, lacking the fuel to steam to sea. When Yamato was finally sent on its one-way suicide mission to Okinawa in April 1945, it did so with barely enough fuel for the outbound journey, a stark symbol of Japan's utter desperation. The empire, built on the promise of resources, was slowly suffocating from within. Italy, the third major Axis power, faced a similar, though perhaps less dramatic, oil crisis. Lacking significant domestic reserves, Italy was almost entirely dependent on imports. Its strategic ambitions in North Africa and the Mediterranean were severely hampered by this vulnerability. The Mediterranean supply convoys, attempting to ferry fuel and other vital supplies from Italy to its forces in Libya and Egypt, became the target of relentless Allied air and naval attacks. The Battle of the Mediterranean was, in many ways, a battle for oil, a desperate struggle to keep the Italian and German forces in North Africa supplied. Rommel's Afrika Corps, despite its legendary tactical prowess, was perpetually on a knife edge regarding fuel. The vast, open deserts of North Africa made logistics a nightmare. Every offensive push, every flanking maneuver, required prodigious amounts of gasoline, and the British and Commonwealth forces, supplied through the relatively secure Suez Canal and Atlantic routes, always had a crucial advantage. Rommel's famous phrase, "The most important thing in war is to have fuel," wasn't just a casual observation, it was the bitter truth of his operational reality. The inability to resupply sufficiently after victories often meant that hard-won gains had to be abandoned, and strategic opportunities squandered. The desert, an unforgiving landscape in itself, became an even more formidable opponent when fuel tanks ran dry. So, we see a consistent pattern across the Axis powers, a fundamental vulnerability to oil shortages that shaped their strategic ambitions, forced their hand into aggressive territorial grabs, and ultimately crippled their ability to sustain prolonged warfare. This wasn't merely a tactical disadvantage, it was a strategic chokehold applied by the Allies. The Allied strategy to exploit this vulnerability was multifaceted and highly effective. For Germany, it involved two key approaches: the naval blockade, which choked off traditional imports, and the sustained bombing campaign against German synthetic fuel plants and captured Romanian oil fields. From 1944 onwards, Allied air superiority allowed for precision bombing raids targeting these crucial facilities. The Plosti oil fields in Romania, a vital source of natural oil for Germany after the collapse of its Russian offensive, were subjected to some of the most intense and costly air raids of the war. Imagine the bravery, or perhaps desperation, of aircrews flying hundreds of miles into heavily defended territory, knowing their target was literally the lifeblood of the enemy's war machine. These bombing campaigns, though costly, had a devastating impact. German synthetic fuel production, which had been gradually increasing, peaked in mid-1944 and then plummeted as plants were damaged or destroyed. The cumulative effect was catastrophic. By the final months of the war, the Luftwaffe, once a terror of the skies, was largely grounded, not because of a lack of planes or pilots, but because of a lack of aviation fuel. German panzer divisions, though still capable of fierce resistance, often found themselves operating on fumes, their mobility severely restricted. The Ardennes Offensive, the Battle of the Bulge, Germany's last desperate gamble, ultimately failed not just due to Allied resilience, but because of critical fuel shortages that hampered its mechanized spearheads. For Japan, the Allied strategy centered on a relentless submarine campaign and the gradual constriction of its sea lanes. American submarines, often operating independently and deep within Japanese-controlled waters, systematically targeted Japanese merchant shipping, especially oil tankers. These wolf packs were incredibly effective. By 1945, Japan's merchant fleet had been decimated, and even if oil was available in the Dutch East Indies, getting it back to the home islands was an increasingly impossible task. The strategic bombing campaign against the Japanese home islands, though focusing on industrial centers, also disrupted the remaining domestic refining capacity. The critical importance of oil extends even to the decisions made in the shadow of the atomic bomb. While the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki are often cited as the singular reason for Japan's surrender, it's crucial to understand the context of Japan's already collapsing war effort. By mid-1945, Japan's economy was in ruins, its cities flattened by conventional bombing, its navy confined to port, and its remaining air force critically short of fuel. The atomic bombs delivered the final, shocking blow, but the groundwork for surrender had been laid by years of relentless pressure, much of it related to the strangulation of its resource base, primarily oil. This narrative, often overshadowed by tales of grand battles and charismatic leaders, reveals a profoundly different understanding of World War II. It exposes the fragility of even the most formidable military powers when deprived of a fundamental resource. It shows how the seemingly mundane mechanics of logistics and resource allocation can dictate the course of history more effectively than any tactical genius or ideological fervor. Consider the human cost of this scarcity. Imagine the morale of soldiers in a tank division, knowing that even if they pushed through enemy lines, their advance might halt ignominiously simply because there wasn't enough gasoline to keep moving. Picture pilots, trained and ready, confined to barracks because the planes they flew were grounded. This wasn't just an abstract strategic problem, it translated directly into disillusionment, despair, and ultimately, defeat on the battlefield. The myth of the unstoppable Axis machine crumbles under the weight of this invisible, insidious enemy, the empty fuel tank. The legacy of these fuel shortages reverberates even today. The geopolitical landscape of the post-war world was profoundly shaped by the control and access to oil. The lessons learned by the Axis powers, and equally by the Allies, underscored the strategic imperative of securing reliable energy supplies. It fueled the Cold War arms race, where energy independence remained a key strategic goal, and it continues to influence international relations and military planning in the 21st century. The ghost of Axis oil scarcity whispers in every modern debate about energy security, reminding us that even in an age of advanced technology, the fundamental resources that power our world remain a potent force in shaping our destiny. So, the next time you hear about the Second World War, remember that it wasn't just a clash of ideologies or armies, it was also a desperate, global struggle for a single, precious commodity. The mighty German panzers, the proud Japanese carriers, the ambitious Italian campaigns, all were ultimately chained by the unseen, unrelenting tyranny of the empty fuel tank. The true power on the battlefield was often not the size of an army or the bravery of its soldiers, but the gushing flow, or suffocating trickle, of crude oil. And perhaps that deeper truth, the realization that even the most ambitious plans can be undone by simple, material realities, is a fear that resonates with us still. It's the insecurity that despite our grand visions, some fundamental, often overlooked, resource might be the one thing that truly dictates our every move. Let's broaden our lens beyond oil and examine these other critical resource deficiencies, starting with iron ore, the very backbone of any industrial war effort. Germany, despite its powerful industrial base, lacked sufficient domestic high-grade iron ore. Prior to the war, it relied heavily on imports, primarily from Sweden and France. The rapid conquest of France in 1940 gave Germany access to the Lorraine iron ore basin, a temporary boon. However, Swedish iron ore remained absolutely crucial, especially the high-quality deposits from Kiruna and Momberget. This dependence on Swedish neutrality and shipping lanes through the Baltic Sea presented a constant strategic vulnerability, one that both the Allies and Germany eyed nervously. Hitler's concern over Swedish neutrality was so pronounced that he resisted overtly hostile actions against Sweden, even as U-boats patrolled the Baltic, knowing that disrupting this supply chain would be a self-inflicted wound. The mere threat of Allied intervention in Scandinavia, or a shift in Swedish policy, kept German planners awake at night, understanding that without this steady influx of iron, the very tanks, artillery, and ships they produced would grind to a halt. For Japan, the iron ore situation was even more dire. An island nation with minimal domestic resources, Japan was almost entirely dependent on imports, primarily from China, Manchuria, and later, the captured territories of Southeast Asia, especially Malaya and the Philippines. The Greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere wasn't just about oil, it was a grand vision to secure a self-sufficient resource base for its burgeoning empire. But much like oil, the problem shifted from acquisition to transportation. Shipping millions of tons of iron ore across vast, submarine-infested waters to the industrial heartland of Japan became an increasingly perilous endeavor. Each sunken ore freighter, much like an oil tanker, represented a direct blow to Japan's ability to produce steel, and therefore, ships, aircraft, and armaments. The quality of some of the captured ores was also often inferior, requiring more intensive processing and further straining Japan's limited industrial capacity. Consider rubber, a material so ubiquitous today that its strategic importance in the 20th century is often overlooked. In World War II, rubber was essential for tires, gaskets, fuel hoses, self-sealing fuel tanks, and countless other military applications. Natural rubber came almost exclusively from Southeast Asia, particularly Malaya and the Dutch East Indies. When Japan launched its lightning conquest of these regions, it effectively seized control of over 90% of the world's natural rubber supply. This was a catastrophic blow to the Allies, especially the United States, which had been caught largely unprepared. The American response was a monumental effort in synthetic rubber production, a testament to industrial innovation under duress. Driven by a desperate need, the U.S. government poured billions of dollars into building synthetic rubber plants, rapidly scaling up production. By 1944, American synthetic rubber output far outstripped pre-war natural rubber imports, becoming a decisive factor in Allied logistical superiority. Meanwhile, for Japan, the control of natural rubber seemed like a strategic triumph. But again, the challenges of transportation and processing loomed large. Shipping vast quantities of raw rubber from distant plantations back to Japan faced the same submarine gauntlet as oil and iron ore. Furthermore, Japan's own synthetic rubber industry was nascent and could not compete with the scale of the Allied effort. While Japanese forces initially had access to abundant natural rubber, the increasing difficulty of bringing it home, coupled with the sheer attrition of its shipping fleet, meant that even this resource became less reliable over time. Tires wore out, equipment deteriorated, and the sheer advantage of having local supplies diminished against the relentless pressure of Allied interdiction. Aluminum, the lightweight metal vital for aircraft construction, also played a critical role. Germany had a relatively strong domestic aluminum industry, relying on bauxite imports, primarily from Hungary and other parts of occupied Europe. This allowed the Luftwaffe to build impressive numbers of aircraft, especially in the early years of the war. However, as the war progressed and Allied bombing intensified, the German aluminum industry faced increasing pressure, not just from direct attacks on production facilities but also from the wider breakdown of infrastructure and labor shortages. Japan, on the other hand, had very limited bauxite resources and was almost entirely dependent on imports from captured territories like Indonesia. This made its aircraft industry particularly vulnerable. The loss of merchant shipping directly impacted the availability of bauxite, and thus, the ability to produce new aircraft, or even repair damaged ones. The materials available were often of lower quality, requiring more intensive processing and leading to less durable components. This became increasingly critical as the war turned against Japan, and its need for combat aircraft skyrocketed to defend the home islands. Tungsten, a rare but vital metal, was essential for hardening steel, particularly for armor-piercing projectiles and machine tools. Without tungsten, high-quality steel production, especially for armaments, was severely hampered. Germany relied heavily on imports from neutral Portugal and Spain, leading to intense diplomatic and covert struggles between the Axis and Allied powers to secure these precious supplies. The Wolfram crisis during the war saw both sides vying for Portugal's tungsten output, offering economic incentives, political pressure, and even intelligence operations to secure their share. This often meant diverting resources and diplomatic efforts that could have been focused elsewhere, all for a seemingly minor but strategically indispensable metal. Allied efforts to disrupt German access to Portuguese tungsten, including preemptive buying and political leverage, put constant pressure on German munitions production. Each of these resource stories paints a similar picture of strategic vulnerability, compounded by the inherent weaknesses of the Axis alliance itself. Unlike the Allies, who, despite their differences, had a more robust global network of resource access, particularly through the vast British Empire and the industrial might of the United States, the Axis powers were geographically dispersed and often competed for the same limited resources. There was no truly integrated economic strategy among Germany, Italy, and Japan. Each pursued its own resource ambitions, often independently and sometimes even at cross purposes, rather than forging a cohesive, mutually reinforcing economic bloc capable of weathering a prolonged global conflict. The Tripartite Pact, signed in September 1940, was a political and military alliance, but it notably lacked a comprehensive economic strategy for resource sharing or collective procurement. Germany, for instance, rarely shared its synthetic fuel technology or its more advanced industrial processes with Japan or Italy, maintaining a degree of technological nationalism even amidst a desperate global struggle. Similarly, Japan's acquisition of Southeast Asian resources benefited Japan primarily, with limited amounts making their way to Germany through blockade runners, and even less to Italy. This internal disunity, this failure to truly pool resources and optimize distribution, amplified their individual supply chain vulnerabilities. The very geography of the Axis powers also worked against them. Germany and Italy were geographically constrained within continental Europe and the Mediterranean, facing Allied naval blockades and eventual air superiority that stifled their external trade. Japan, an island nation, was even more vulnerable to maritime interdiction. Their efforts to create autarkic, self-sufficient, economic blocs, Germany's Großraumwirtschaft in Europe and Japan's Greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere, were ultimately too little, too late, and too geographically vulnerable to sustain a prolonged war against powers with superior global reach and more resilient supply chains. Consider the role of logistics and infrastructure. Even when resources were acquired, the sheer challenge of transporting them to where they were needed was often insurmountable. Germany's advance into the Soviet Union, as we discussed, was crippled not just by a lack of oil, but by the absence of suitable roads, the vast distances, and the differing rail gauges between German and Soviet systems. This meant that even if the Caucasian oil fields had been seized, the infrastructure to transport that oil back to the Eastern Front, let alone to Germany, simply did not exist or would have taken years to build under wartime conditions. The dream was tantalizing, but the practical reality was a logistical nightmare. Similarly, Japan's ambition to create a vast, resource-rich empire across Southeast Asia ran headlong into the logistical limitations of its merchant marine. While its conquests were swift, the capacity to exploit those resources and transport them back to the home islands was always insufficient. The ships, the port facilities, the trained crews, all were finite and increasingly vulnerable to Allied attack. The further Japan expanded, the more thinly stretched its supply lines became, creating an ever larger target for Allied submarines and aircraft. The Allied strategy to exploit these wider resource vulnerabilities evolved throughout the war. Beyond the oil campaigns, the relentless bombing of German industrial centers targeted factories producing steel, aluminum, and synthetic materials. Transportation networks, railways, bridges, canals, were systematically attacked, disrupting the flow of raw materials to factories and finished goods to the front lines. This wasn't just about destroying a tank factory, it was about preventing the iron or coal and other components from ever reaching it, or preventing the finished tanks from ever reaching the battlefield. For Japan, the submarine campaign was broader than just oil tankers. It targeted all merchant shipping, effectively strangling the flow of every critical raw material, iron ore, bauxite, rubber, or food, into the Japanese home islands, and preventing the export of finished goods or reinforcements to its distant garrisons. By 1945, Japan was not just short of fuel, it was running out of everything. Its economy was collapsing not just from direct bombing, but from a complete strangulation of its external trade, a deliberate and effective strategy of resource denial. The impact of these resource shortages extended beyond the purely material. They had a profound psychological and moral effect on the Axis war effort. The constant rationing, the improvised solutions, the knowledge that their enemies possessed a seemingly endless supply of materials, while they scraped and scrounged for every ton, gnawed at the morale of soldiers and civilians alike. Imagine the despair of a German armaments worker knowing that despite their best efforts, the lack of crucial alloys meant the tanks they produced were inferior, or that planes sat idle for lack of specialized components. Or a Japanese soldier in a remote Pacific outpost, watching supplies dwindle, knowing that no more would come, because the ships bringing them were at the bottom of the ocean. This invisible hand of resource scarcity subtly reshaped political decisions and military doctrine. Germany's focus on blitzkrieg, for example, wasn't just a tactical preference, it was born of a strategic necessity to win quickly before its finite resources ran out. The entire German war economy was built on the premise of rapid, decisive victories, financing itself through the plunder of conquered territories. It was not designed for a protracted war of attrition against resource-rich opponents. When the war bogged down on the Eastern Front, this fundamental flaw became devastatingly apparent. Japan's decision to strike at Pearl Harbor, while an act of strategic desperation born of the oil embargo, also reflected a broader gamble on rapid expansion to secure a resource base that could then be defended. The idea was to create an impregnable resource fortress that the Americans would eventually accept as a fait accompli. But this gamble ignored the sheer industrial might and resource resilience of the United States, which, when fully mobilized, could not only sustain its own war effort but also supply its allies on an unprecedented scale. The post-war landscape of international relations, economics, and military strategy bears the indelible imprint of these resource struggles. The creation of international organizations focused on trade and resource access, the meticulous strategic planning around mineral deposits and trade routes, and the ongoing emphasis on energy security for modern nations are all direct legacies of the harsh lessons learned in World War II. Nations like Germany and Japan, once driven by resource scarcity to imperial expansion, became champions of global free trade and international cooperation, understanding that guaranteed access to resources through peaceful commerce was far more stable and sustainable than acquisition by force. The Cold War, too, was heavily influenced by resource considerations. The US and Soviet Union competed fiercely for influence over resource-rich regions, particularly in the Middle East and Africa, recognizing that control over oil, strategic minerals, and other raw materials was a critical component of global power. Energy independence, or at least diversity of supply, became a core strategic objective for many nations, a direct echo of Germany's and Japan's wartime vulnerabilities. Today, as we grapple with global supply chain disruptions, energy transitions, and the geopolitics of rare earth minerals, the story of Axis resource shortages serves as a potent historical analogy. It reminds us that even in an era of advanced technology, the physical realities of resource availability and access remain fundamental drivers of conflict and cooperation. The intricate web of global supply chains, often taken for granted, is a fragile system, and its disruption can have cascading effects far beyond the immediate economic consequences. The myth of the unstoppable war machine, impervious to material limitations, continues to be challenged by the cold, hard facts of history. The Axis powers, despite their initial military successes and technological prowess, ultimately succumbed not just to the bravery of Allied soldiers or the genius of Allied commanders, but to a deeper, more insidious enemy, the relentless, suffocating tyranny of empty fuel tanks, rusting machines, and depleted stockpiles. Their every move, every strategic decision, every grand ambition, was ultimately dictated by the precious, finite, and often tragically out of reach, flow of the world's resources. It's a testament to how profoundly the material world shapes human events, often in ways we only fully grasp in hindsight, reminding us that true power isn't just in the weapons you wield, but in the resources that sustain their very operation. The story, then, is not just one of military might or ideological clashes, but a profound narrative about vulnerability. It's about the limits of ambition when faced with the unforgiving realities of geology and logistics. It's a cautionary tale, etched in the annals of history, of how the pursuit of dominance can be undone by the absence of something as fundamental as a barrel of oil or a chunk of iron ore. And for us, watching decades later, it offers a stark reminder: to understand the grand movements of history, we must sometimes look beneath the surface, to the silent, often invisible, forces that truly dictate our every move. The myth crumbles, replaced by a more complex, and ultimately, more human story of struggle against overwhelming material odds. Consider Germany's domestic response to resource scarcity. Beyond the scientific marvel of synthetic fuel, the entire civilian economy was systematically reoriented towards war production, with an intensity that bordered on the fanatical. Rationing became a way of life, enforced with increasing severity. Scraps of metal, textiles, and even food were collected with nationalistic fervor. Women were mobilized into factories, and later, slave labor from occupied territories became a ghastly, if inefficient, stopgap for manpower shortages that impacted every aspect of resource extraction and industrial processing. Propaganda relentlessly emphasized sacrifice, self-sufficiency, autarky, and the necessity of conquest to secure the nation's future. Every German citizen was, in essence, a cog in a vast war machine desperately trying to overcome inherent resource limitations. This constant struggle trickled down to the individual household, creating a pervasive atmosphere of scarcity that corroded morale over time, despite the initial patriotic zeal. The promise of an abundant Lebensraum fueled by Eastern resources became a bitter mockery as Germans at home faced ever harsher conditions. For Japan, the impact on civilian life was equally profound and perhaps even more immediate due to its extreme dependence on imports. The slogan "Luxuries are our enemy" became a national mantra, as the government systematically stripped away consumer goods and redirected all industrial capacity towards military ends. Civilian vehicles disappeared from the roads, replaced by charcoal-powered cars or bicycles. Food rationing became severe, and essential goods vanished from shelves. The Japanese people were told that their sacrifices were necessary to secure a greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere that would ultimately provide them with inexhaustible resources. Yet, as the war progressed and the Allied blockade tightened, the disconnect between this promise and the reality of daily deprivation became stark. Malnutrition became widespread, and the constant fear of bombing raids, coupled with the gnawing hunger, eroded the social fabric. The spirit of Yamato, meant to inspire unwavering resilience, was tested to its breaking point by the stark, undeniable evidence of material exhaustion. Even Italy, perhaps the least industrially powerful of the Axis, saw its population endure severe hardships due to resource shortages. Its limited indigenous resources and relatively weaker industrial base meant that even before the war, Italy struggled to sustain its population without significant imports. Once Allied blockades and campaigns in the Mediterranean cut off these supplies, the Italian civilian economy collapsed rapidly. Food, fuel, and basic necessities became critically scarce, contributing to widespread discontent, strikes, and ultimately, the toppling of Mussolini's regime. The dreams of a resurgent Roman Empire, sustained by Mediterranean resources, dissolved into the grim reality of breadlines and empty gas tanks. These internal struggles highlight a crucial, often overlooked, dimension of the Axis defeat: the failure to adequately manage and sustain the home front under conditions of prolonged resource deprivation. While the Allies, particularly the United States, faced their own challenges with industrial mobilization and rationing, their resource base and logistical superiority allowed them to sustain their populations and war efforts with far greater resilience. The arsenal of democracy was fueled by abundant oil, iron, rubber, and other raw materials, allowing for a sustained production of war material that simply overwhelmed the Axis. This disparity in material endurance was, in many ways, the ultimate deciding factor. The Allied leadership understood this fundamental imbalance. They weren't just fighting battles on land, sea, and air, they were waging an economic war of attrition, deliberately targeting the Axis's Achilles heel, its reliance on finite, vulnerable resource flows. The strategic bombing campaigns against German oil and industrial targets, the relentless submarine warfare against Japanese shipping, the blockade of Axis ports, these were not merely ancillary operations. They were central to the grand strategy, designed to systematically dismantle the enemy's capacity to wage war by severing its material lifelines. This comprehensive approach by the Allies, combining military pressure with economic strangulation, underscores the multifaceted nature of modern warfare. It wasn't enough to defeat enemy armies in the field, one had to destroy their ability to produce those armies and to fuel their operations. The unseen hand of resource control proved to be a more patient, more insidious, and ultimately, more decisive force than any single tank division or aircraft carrier group. Reflecting on this narrative, it becomes clear that the myth of Axis oil and the broader myth of Axis invincibility crumble under the weight of historical scrutiny. The image of the inexorable, fully fueled war machine is replaced by a far more complex picture of improvisation, desperation, and strategic miscalculation driven by fundamental material constraints. The Axis leadership, blinded by ambition and ideology, consistently overestimated their ability to overcome these limitations through conquest, innovation, or sheer will. Their military strategies were often gambles against the clock, races to seize resources before their existing reserves ran dry, rather than sustainable campaigns. The ultimate lesson of this story isn't just a historical footnote about World War II, it's a timeless principle about the enduring importance of material realities in shaping human conflict and destiny. Even in the age of information warfare and advanced cybernetics, the physical world, its resources, and the intricate global supply chains that connect them, remain potent forces. Nations continue to jockey for control over strategic minerals, energy sources, and critical trade routes, recognizing that the foundation of national power and military capability still rests upon the reliable flow of raw materials. So, the next time you reflect on the colossal struggle of World War II, look beyond the grand personalities and the heroic battles. Listen closely for the silent whisper of the empty fuel tank, the grinding halt of the unfueled factory, and the desperate scramble for a handful of rubber or iron ore. These were the true, often invisible, protagonists that dictated every move, shaped every strategy, and ultimately authored the final, tragic chapters of the Axis war machine. It's a powerful, sobering reminder that the most formidable human ambitions can, and often do, run aground on the unyielding shores of material scarcity. And in that humbling realization, perhaps lies a deeper understanding of history, and indeed, of our own future.